Good morning, Grid Connections listeners. Today we are thrilled to have John Voelcker, contributing editor at Car and Driver magazine and host of Tempting Fate Tours, join us again. In this exciting episode, we dive deep into the latest EV sales numbers, providing you with the most up-to-date insights in the electric vehicle market. John shares his first-hand experience test driving GM's Ultium vehicles, from their new electric crossovers to their large electric SUVs and trucks. We explore the innovations and challenges faced by GM with their current electric product line. But that's not all. John also takes us on a journey to England, where he recently met with the team at Polestar. We discuss their current EV offerings and get a sneak peek into their future products. You can find a link to John's recent articles on Polestar and many other in today's show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, we do have a small request. Please share it with at least one other person who might find it interesting as well, and don't forget to leave a positive review on our podcast page. Your support helps us bring more insightful content to you each week. With that, enjoy. I know there's been a lot of great topics since we talked last. It's been about 6 months. And you've done some travels to all sorts of different events. You've been testing new cars, among other things. So let's just kind of kick it off with, we might actually, I guess, be working backwards. But I know one of the things we wanted to talk about today was just the recent quarterly EV sales.
Sure. We don't analyze sales month by month anymore because a lot of car makers have stopped issuing monthly sales. They do them quarterly. Made people like me very grumbly initially, but quarterly is not so bad, and in some ways you may get less noise level quarter to quarter. But EV sales continue to rise despite the headlines you may have read, and I am at this point reduced to quoting Barbie. Math class can be hard. A decline in the rate of sales growth is not a decline in sales. And
Right.
in fact, one of the big questions for analysts, we were at about 6% EVs out of the total market sold in 2022. We were at about 8% last year, 2023. Will we hit 10% this year, 2024? And I tend to think that one of the factors that we're not necessarily including when we look at the second half of this year is GM finally is starting to move significant numbers of Ultium vehicles. First, in Q2, really out of their factories into their dealers, although the sales numbers ticked up. But I think in Q3 and Q4, we'll see some significant sales from GM, just as they've sort of washed out the last significant numbers of Bolt EVs and EUVs. So I look forward to that. I'm actually driving a Chevy Blazer EV this week, and that's the last of the Ultiums now on the market that I hadn't driven. So Blazer EV, Silverado EV, most recently the Equinox EV, which I liked quite a lot, and then prior to that, the Cadillac Lyriq and the GMC Hummer EV in both of its body styles. So there will be more Ultium vehicles coming. They've already announced the Escalade IQ. Cadillac Celestiq, the ultra-luxury sedan for $300,000, isn't really a major sales mover, although it's a prestige car. But there will be others that GM hasn't announced. There's a Cadillac, for instance, the Vistiq, smaller. So all in all, I think if the rest of the market continues doing what it did in the first and second quarters, and you add GM to that, plus there's Honda Prologues made by GM and Acura ZDXs made by GM, then we should see some numbers. What happened in Q2 is that most of the folks who are not Tesla were up. Not all of them, and I won't go through the list. Tesla, however, being roughly 50% of the market in the US, if, as the saying goes, if they catch a cold, if they sneeze, the entire industry catches a cold. And Tesla, for the first time, was less than 50% of all the EVs sold in the US. Now, that's battery electrics, which is all Tesla makes, and plug-in hybrids. I have an article on plug-in hybrids coming out within the next week or 10 days. Watch for it. But I remain guardedly optimistic that 10% of the market is not an unreasonable thing for us to hope for.
By what time?
By the end of this year.
End of this year. Okay. No, I think that's a pretty realistic expectation. looking at it's funny you mentioned the thing about Tesla sales, because there were two things that I noticed. You're right that Tesla's sales brought down the overall market, but then coincidentally, I forget, not by a whole lot, but then ironically, because of the Cybertruck sales and the actual price of it, it caused the average EV price to go up just slightly, which is kind of a funny twist. But you're right. If you kind of take them out and you start looking at a lot of the domestic players, especially, there's pretty positive growth signs.
Yeah.
With
I think the Cybertruck is really one of the big unknowns for Tesla.
Right.
I was told I have now met the owner of the first Tesla Cybertruck in Woodstock, New York, who told me that it was clear that everybody else was going to be driving these 5 years hence. It's so advanced that the Detroit truck makers have no idea what to do, can't keep up, and so on. And he expects there to be many dozens of them in Woodstock 3 or 5 years hence. That's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is this a vehicle, once you get past Tesla's existing audience, the early adopters, and those people who really want to make a statement, driving what I have tended to describe as something that looks like a dystopian movie prop? Once you get past that set of people, are the truck users who buy hundreds of thousands of F-150s and Ram 1500s and Chevy Silverados going to adopt something like the Cybertruck, especially given its price points? Very much up in the air right now. I have my own thoughts, but I'm going to wait till the end of the year like everything else, and then we can sort out the pieces.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think at the price point, there's definitely not going to be a strong room for it to scale beyond where it's at right now. But at the same time, it's supposed to come down.
With the promised range.
Right.
I mean,
actually, I will push back on that though. What's really interesting is I was kind of looking at this the other day, going through the specs, and yeah, the big thing was that the $80,000 one's supposed to have 500 miles, but the all-wheel drive one actually has more than they said. It was only going to have like 300. So I will say, obviously, that's what got everyone hyped up, was this 500-mile range one. So it was just really interesting to kind of look at, like, with inflation of these things since it's been announced. Like, it is a miss, but numbers wise, I was actually surprised how close it was than some people have been saying. It's still not one for one, but just a caveat. Yeah,
it is not. I mean, it would have been the only pickup truck with 500 miles, right? It is not the only pickup truck, battery electric, that has 300 miles of range. So in that sense,
Oh, for sure. And I think with the GM products, you're seeing, I am curious to see, kind of talking about the Ultium platform, how scalable the 200 kilowatt hour plus battery packs will be. And for those to scale at price point and parity. But it is interesting you say that, not to go down the Cybertruck rabbit hole. I feel like that's something it's something we've definitely done before here. But I think my surprise has just been the impressions of people in real life versus online are almost night and day. I don't have one personally, just to clarify. But whenever I've been in public and one goes by, I feel like the last month especially, I've seen a bunch of them go by. And people are like, what is that? That's really cool. And then you tell them the price point or something. They're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Which is kind of ironic to me also because of like how basic it looks, that the general public, the non-automotive space, seems to think that a very simple shape means it's more expensive. But no, I agree with you. It'll be interesting to see if the average traditional gas pickup buyer also adopts these. But that could be a podcast unto itself. But
and my only anecdote is, you and I live in different places in the world. Possibly the folks that you run into who are repeatedly saying that's really cool are more forward looking. I have seen probably a 50-50 mix, and I did see one guy flip off a Cybertruck. Just standing on the sidewalk, saw it, and I won't do the gesture because you're recording, but you know what it looks like, and it was not a respectful, that's cool gesture. So, we'll see.
No, and it is funny. Yeah, and I think one caveat also to say to that is it does seem to be a generational if someone is like under 40, there seems to be a much higher likelihood they think it's interesting. And I think you're 39, right, John? So you're kind of right just on the
Bless you, my
precipice there.
child.
Yeah, yeah. As a 35-year-old, I'm kind of on the precipice too of determining whether I like it or not.
So I'm more
But
than twice as old as you are.
yeah, I I let's change the subject.
Yeah.
But no, I appreciate the diversity in thought on that because I agree with you. Like good or bad, I think if you're a car enthusiast, whether you hate it or not, you just kind of have to respect it for being so different. With after like the last decade and a half of kind of having more cars becoming a little bit more amorphous. I
Mhm.
don't know if that was the right direction. But at least I think it's what's kind of opened the door for like companies like Hyundai and others to do more kind of angular and edgier design, and maybe make something
I'm
that
not
is
sure
more
I draw
approachable.
that cause
Really?
and effect. The question, I think, looking at automotive history is in terms of something really different, you know, is this a striking design? I don't know, let's take the Chrysler 300 in 2006, which was
Okay.
that square,
Yeah.
gangster looking sedan. No one had ever seen a sedan like that
Yeah.
before from an American maker, at least since the 60s. That was widely admired, I think, as a striking form that a lot of people looked at. Or is it the Pontiac Aztec?
See,
Which was not.
not to keep this conversation going, I totally get the Aztec comparison. I almost think it's like more Lamborghini Countach. The Countach looks better, but it's like this absurd level of angular design that just doesn't
Mm,
look like it should work.
mm.
And maybe it doesn't. But
Moving off Cybertruck.
yes. No, let's go back to Ultium though, because I'm really
All
curious
right.
since you've driven
Great.
a lot more of those than I have around the actual. Let's start with the trucks, especially.
Mhm.
What has been kind of your experience talking about a truck that's got over at least 400 miles of range, but has these heavy battery packs, and they themselves are pretty heavy trucks, even by large truck standards. What has kind of been your experience with that product line? And I guess to ask the same thing, do you think that that is something that the traditional truck buyer is going to be open to? Or is it just inherently going to be still a huge hurdle for that market due to it being EVs and EVs are bad now?
Um, there's a lot wrapped into that
Yeah.
question. Um, First thing, I continue to question GM's making what I think of as the avalanche,
Yeah.
which is to
Yeah.
say a single body with sail panels, four-door truck, essentially like the Chevy Avalanche from,
Yeah.
what was it, 2002 to 2011 or some
Kind of
some
early
period like.
2000s. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was beloved by its owners, but the highest ever sales of the Avalanche in 1 year, if I remember correctly, was well under 100,000
Yeah.
units. So it was not a substantial portion
It had a
of,
strong following, but right.
yeah,
Didn't move
yeah.
the needle.
So, and as Ford will point out frequently and often, is that their F-150 Lightning uses all the standard upfits that businesses have taken, created, or bought for their existing gasoline F-150s. And you can just drop those directly into an F-150 Lightning. So it shows the two companies' different approaches, really.
For sure.
GM, Mrs. Barra, the CEO, has maintained for years that EV sales will be additive. They're not going to be substitutive. They will get new people who would not necessarily have bought a gasoline or diesel Silverado who will buy an electric one. Ford says essentially some of it will be additive, some of it can be substitutive because of all the fleet benefits to running an
Right.
electric truck. And of course, they have Ford Pro, which is all of the telematics data. They have a nice sort of way of tracking charging data, et cetera, et cetera. GM has now started something like that, but they are rather behind compared to Ford. So it's two different approaches. And I'm very much looking forward to driving the Ram 1500 Rev, which is the battery electric one, and Ram Charger, which is the series hybrid one, series plug-in hybrid. So whether or not all three of those variants, all of whom have really loyal followings,
Yeah.
audiences, um, remains to be seen. Good to have another entrant. I do tend to point to the Japanese, who have been trying for 25 years to break into
That's a
the
good
US
point.
full-size pickup market. Toyota builds them in Texas. They have their truck development lab there. The Toyota Tundra, after 20 plus years, is just not a major factor in volume. I think it's 100, maybe 150,000, compared to selling about 1 million F-Series pickups for Ford.
Right.
Similar numbers for Chevy Silverado plus GMC Sierra, same truck, different clothes. And Nissan gave up, and they're out of that market entirely. So we'll see. There is, of course, the meme that went around. I don't know if you saw this. A whole bunch of letters stuck to the back of a truck window that said, never mind Cummins versus Power Stroke. Forget about Ford versus
Yeah.
Chevy. We all have to band together and defeat this EV. So, don't know how that attitude will play out. Fleet makers will like the lower running costs, but you had asked me umpty minutes ago about driving the trucks. Like most Americans, I actually drive small trucks. I had a Subaru Outback until recently. So my main impression is they're really big and heavy. They have a great ride. They have good acceleration, good regenerative braking, and the Hummer, which has rear wheel steering, is shockingly maneuverable.
Yeah.
It's really, I had not expected a 9,200-pound vehicle to be quite as, I'm not sure nimble is the word, but quite as easy to drive, given that you're several feet off the ground and you're driving something
Right.
the size of a small municipal hospital. But I also took a photo at one of the roads that leads to my house that says weight limit
I was
4
just going to
tons.
ask you about that. Yeah.
Now, experience has told us, quite frankly, the truck owners do not care about such things.
Right.
When I asked GM about the weight of the Hummer EV as tested, I have in mind 9,240 pounds. That was the top trim one.
There's something in a 9. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a healthy
GM
car.
said, oh, as it says in all of our documents and in the owner's handbook, it is the responsibility of the owner of the vehicle to comply with all state, federal, and local ordinances regarding the operation of the vehicle. If we go back in history, remember when there was that tax break where small businesses could write off certain types of vehicles in 1 year, and a whole bunch of people bought Hummer H1s because they were over the 3-ton weight limit? They often, using those for commuting, tended to live in pricey suburbs, which, at least where I'm from, often have little tiny winding 19th or 18th or 17th century roads, which have 3-ton bridges. Do you think they obeyed those? Hell no. So we'll see. Let us hope there are no bridge failures.
Well, I think it's so funny too, because I believe like back then the H2 Hummer, whichever Hummer it was like 6,200 pounds. Like it crossed the line, but just barely. And then you look at the EVs in this space now, and it is good to see some of them are coming down weight, especially the smaller ones. But yeah, you got the Rivians of the world and everything else that just go blow right past that on the weight size. And I think it is definitely something that needs to be considered and talked about more. But it's definitely something I've also seen picked up already by the anti-EV groups. They're like, oh, these things are so heavy. Meanwhile, they are also driving their F-350 that is in the same ballpark.
Shocked at the sudden concern over the terrible cardiopulmonary effects of excess tire particles from EVs. I must have missed those folks' concern over that same issue before EVs existed.
I know it's I missed that news too, John. I'm not sure where it's being broadcast, but it's definitely not on our radar. I did want to ask you. You mentioned you recently owned a Subaru. And you talked about a pickup, so I have to ask you: was it the Subaru Baja?
It was not the Subaru Baja, or as my better half calls it, the Baja. No, they are still running around. And
Yeah,
actually,
I just saw one the other day. Yeah,
yeah,
they are a collector's item. It is so fun. It's not my cup of tea, but living here on the West Coast, especially in Oregon,
sure,
they are a
sure,
hot
sure.
commodity. If you have one, it's kind of bragging rights even. And it just seems like they only ever made them in like red and a searing yellow. That seems to be the only.
We mostly see the yellow ones, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, um, so I have somewhat less experience with the big Ultium trucks than I do with the passenger vehicles. Lyric. I said I was fairly impressed by the Equinox. The Blazer that I'm driving now gets a lot of looks. I can't tell if they're favorable or not. Haven't gotten any thumbs up, but it's that really lovely sort of deep metallic, uh, not quite maroon, but darker red.
yeah.
And it really pops. I just find the styling a little bit overwrought. The Equinox is a much simpler, fairly, I don't want to say plain because
I
that
was gonna
sounds
say,
like a
would you say
bad thing.
the Blazer is almost over stylized and the Equinox is like under stylized? I kind of feel like they're a little bit. They're not bad, but it is kind of interesting that I think they're just a little bit off the mark, at least in my taste,
Um,
styling
I
wise.
think the Equinox shape actually works. I spent a
Gotcha.
fair amount of time with it. I took an absolute ton of pictures, and it's color sensitive, but it's basically a shape that's not going to scare anyone,
Right. Right.
which I think for the highest volume entrant
For sure.
in GM's growing EV line is the right approach to take. The controls are fairly understandable. They're pretty much the same screens as in the latest combustion engine GM cars and SUVs and trucks. And so, unlike the Model 3, which has gotten even less understandable if a newbie sits down the first time, and we expect the Model Y to go that route at some point. The Equinox is relatively understandable for someone fresh to get in it, figure out how to drive it. And I like the package. It's not light, but it's lighter than the Blazer EV.
Yeah.
Still has a lot of room inside. I can sit behind myself. It's pushing the upper limits of the compact SUV designation, but
Yeah.
everything has
Right.
bracket crept. I mean, it's probably the size of a Toyota Highlander 20 years ago, but the Toyota Highlander 20 years ago would be tiny today. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
I know one of the concerns or reviews of it has just been overall good, and then kind of where it fell apart was around the charging. I was just curious if there was anything, or if in your experience you'd seen that too. Um,
So it seemed to charge well over 100 kilowatts. I didn't get a chance to charge it personally. Somebody
Gotcha.
else who did said he was in the 138, 145 range. Um, it was never realistic to expect that the Blazer EV and all the rest were going to have 800-volt charging. Um, GM's take is that given the range of charges at which people start, some people are like, oh my God, 50% battery, I need to charge immediately. You're
Yeah.
not going to get the benefit of 800-volt charging if you're charging from 50 to 80%. You're just, 1 or
Right.
2 minutes maybe.
Right.
When I charged the Blazer yesterday, I saw a consistent 154 kilowatts. I started with 24%, I think.
Yeah. Gotcha.
And, it took, what did it take? It took probably 12, 15 minutes. I'd have to look at the screen to get to the point where I was well over half. I had comfortable range, and there was no reason to sit there and
Keep
pay
going.
64 cents a kilowatt hour any
Oh
more than I
wow.
needed to. But,
Whoa.
uh,
Where
but
was that at?
yeah. So I think the challenge
Yeah.
comes, and this is really something that no automakers have dealt with because they don't have to. The challenge comes not with the first buyer of these new EVs,
Right.
because 4 out of 5, I've said this before, I think I said this last time, 4 out of 5
Probably.
households that have the income to
Yeah.
be able to buy a new car of any sort at an average price of $48,000 have dedicated off-street parking. Only 1 in 5 really don't have a place to charge, whether they street park or whether they're a really expensive condo or whatever it may be. So those people will find their ways to charging at home overnight and or at work. So the automakers are kind of, that's how our data says people will charge. It's just that they don't have car makers sell new cars. They don't have to care about the used car market, which is 2.5 times
Yeah.
as large. It's a much harder problem for the used car market.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of I recently went to a dealership to help with kind of an education thing, and it was very interesting approaching them on both and talking to them about not just the new used car sales of EVs, but I'm sorry, selling new EVs, but then also how to price it against like a used EV, and then the idea of the $4,000 credit that a lot of people would qualify for it just gets to a point, unfortunately, where it just seems like they don't want to deal with it. It makes it too complicated in the sale. But you're totally right. I think that is a market that's really under, I guess, talked about and kind of built for the right support to get people who may be interested or even have a lifestyle that would work for an EV and don't fully appreciate that or understand that. And it's just the resources when you go to buy a car definitely do not incentivize that kind of conversation, unfortunately. It seems like to me, at least right now.
Yeah. The folks who think most about this are the ones who are involved in questions of charging equity,
Yeah.
and making public EV charging available to those households that are not necessarily wealthy suburban or urban households that can buy new cars. But how do you make it possible for lower income families, people who are much more likely to live in multiple dwellings, to own
Right.
an EV practically? And, a single public charging station 8 blocks away is probably not that. So these are tougher questions. Used EV prices they plummeted at one point. They seem to be returning, and there's a lot of variation depending on what the car's range is. We now see a lot of used Tesla Model 3s, so that's a range over 200 miles. Used Nissan Leafs that started out at 76 miles or 115 miles or whatever and have battery degradation, that's an entirely different piece of the market, and
Yeah.
justifiably many people simply won't consider them.
Well, and I think it's really interesting too. The price point that a lot of those are like you can easily get one for like $6,000,
Mhm.
and if it kind of goes back to exactly what you're talking about, if you have two or three cars and you just need a round town vehicle and you have that luxury, why not? It makes a lot of sense. But if you're in the situation where it needs to be your primary vehicle to get around day to day, you're totally right. There's definitely a struggle there.
And
Uh,
I think there is data that shows that lower income households put more miles on their vehicles than do higher income households. I don't know if that's because higher income households can split among more vehicles. I think the average American household has 2 point something vehicles. The average high income US household has 3 point something vehicles. But especially if they're living in a place and they have to drive a long way to get to a job,
right.
um, a what we in the Northeast call a commuter car or a station car probably isn't going to cut it, because that could be a 30 to 60 mile trip each way every day. So,
Right. Yeah, that's kind of the area where I'm at too. It's like it's easily in that bracket where it just unless you want to really risk it in the winter and you have charging at work, it just doesn't seem feasible for a lot of people to have that stress of it. But enough about the challenges of used EVs. Let's talk about the Polestar 5 that you
yeah.
recently drove and
I didn't
did an
drive
article
it.
on.
I
Oh,
rode
okay.
along.
Oh,
Yeah.
got you.
So I give Polestar credit. They've been extremely quiet because they've really only had one vehicle for 4 years now, 3 years now, the Polestar 2, which, to their credit, they have continuously refined. I think the industry was quite shocked when they said, nah, the single motor one, front drive, that's for low end economy stuff. We're going to make it rear drive, which, to be fair, Volkswagen had done. Some of the Hyundais are that way. So, but the Polestar 2 has indeed been upgraded multiple times. And I had the interesting experience. I have driven right-hand drive cars, and 3 weeks ago I drove one for quite a long distance, but excuse me, I drove in a right-hand drive country in a left-hand drive car, but driving a right-hand drive car in England for a couple hundred miles, really, it took a while for the you'll never forget how to ride a bicycle skills to
Yeah.
come back. I've found I have to turn on a little voice just behind my left ear that constantly says, stay left, stay left, stay left, stay left, stay left. And it worked, didn't hit anything.
Yeah.
And actually, the nice gentleman from Polestar the second day said, you're fine. I'm going to ride with some of the other people. So, but Polestar finally has a product line. The Polestar 3, which is their SUV, same platform as the Volvo EX90. Both of those vehicles are now entering early production in South Carolina in a plant built for that purpose. And Polestar will also have the 4, which is one of those peculiar coupe crossover hatchback, fastback somethings, and doesn't have a rear window. But those two cars will pad out the lineup. So you'll have the 2, 3, 4. And now it's time for Polestar to talk about what's coming next year, which will be a 2026 Polestar 5. It is, in simplest terms, their competitor for the Tesla Model S, the Porsche Panamera, and Taycan, and cars of that category. High dollar, luxury, sporty, four-door sedans. And they built an R&D facility in England because while England just has the remains of an auto industry, Jaguar Land Rover is allowed to dispute that, but there's not what there used to be. England still is stuffed with really good automotive engineering. It's where most of Formula One comes out of, enormous amounts of motorsport. And that's all centered in the Midlands around a town called Coventry. And so they opened an R&D shop there 3 maybe 4 years ago. And they've just expanded it and taken another property that's more than twice as big because they found their engineers were spending a lot of time just playing Jenga and parking cars. And so we got to tour both shops. The Polestar 5 is a bonded aluminum structure. So in the new facility, they have a gigantic oven that they simply put the prototype in to test out different glues, different temperature cycles, none of which they'll talk about in detail. A lot of IP there. But they are developing the car, some of the materials, and all of the handling and what they call the integration, which is making sure all the different pieces, the interior, the powertrain, the suspension, the fabrication, all play well together.
That's really interesting. I had kind of been reading a little bit about that, and I'm curious in your kind of take and experience as someone who's seen a lot of different automakers kind of position different cars and their manufacturing styles. What about this really stood out to you? And was there anything that, good or bad, that you're like, oh, this will be the way moving forward a lot of EVs are made? Or is this still kind of like, yeah, this would work for a four-door high-end saloon like you're talking about, but we're not going to be seeing more kind of entry-level vehicles made this way?
It is not a very high volume process.
Yeah.
Stamping stuff out of steel is known, and above a certain volume of production, it's cheaper and easier. The Polestar 5 has a combination of cast, milled, and sheet aluminum components, which are bonded together. They didn't say glued, they always said bonded, so I noted that. But it is inevitably a more step-intensive process than stamping an entire side of a vehicle and simply having robots welded all together. What it does allow, according to them, is once you get the basic platform, you can do different vehicles, new top hats as they call them, really, really quickly. And so the Polestar 5 is the four-door luxury sedan. They talked a little bit. They acknowledged the Polestar 6, which is going to be their sports car, but on the same platform. Shorter, no foot garage in the battery, as we discovered. Um, but it'll have the same 111 kilowatt hour battery pack, 800 volt architecture, etc. They expect the 6 to take only a fraction of the development time that the 5 did to develop the whole platform. And I think it is inevitable there will be Volvos and some other Geely brands on that architecture as well. As the CEO, his name is Engelnath, said, it would be selfish of us to keep it all for ourselves. Translation, yep, they're going to use it too. But it is Polestar's first unique platform, dedicated platform, because the 2 was on the same platform as let me get this right now, XC40 Recharge and C40. And the 3 is on the EX90 platform, and the 4 is on, I'm forgetting the numbers, but I think it's a variant of the EX30 platform. So this is, for the moment, unique to Polestar. It was fun talking to British engineers. I have a little bit of Brit in my background. And one of the great things of all of those engineers have worked on a prodigious variety of vehicles over their professional careers. A portion of their team actually came from consulting on a different Geely product, which was the plug-in hybrid EV London Taxi. Those black taxis are now plug-in hybrids. You couldn't get more different than that and the Polestar 5, but some of the underlying technology, including aluminum bonding, same stuff. So, and the London Taxi by nature is a fairly low volume one. So I discovered that one of the engineers, as a very young man, had worked on suspension tuning for my very own Isuzu Impulse from 1991. Who knew? It's a car that, I can show it to auto industry people or other auto journalists. Even a lot of them don't really know what it is because Isuzu stopped making cars 32 years ago. And he grinned and he said, "Oh, I spent a lot of time on that car at Fujisawa." So that was a nice little connection.
That is quite the small world connection there. But yeah, it is really interesting, the overlap in a lot of these Chinese EV brands, especially, that are kind of doubling down in the UK for you're totally right, of the kind of high density of very skilled automotive engineers. And some of that being from kind of racing and Formula One, that I think not only is it platform building at scale, but it's also trying to kind of get out a lot of the weight that have plagued some of the traditional EVs. I am kind of curious on your thoughts. I mean, you were having the same issue I have all the time around Polestar and Volvo making some really interesting products, but there just seems to be a lot of gray area as to remembering which is which, and the kind of like how they divert. I mean, it used to make sense. Polestar was Volvo's like M brand, so that was like the high end stuff. And now you're starting to see this kind of more and more overlap, some of that due to the parent company Geely. But I'm kind of curious, in what you saw and kind of touring the factory and having the kind of more hands-on experience, how would you define the Polestar brand versus Volvo right now? Is it still kind of trying to be more of a premium driver's car brand? Because it seems like both Volvo and, to some extent, Polestar are kind of like, Polestar is less about the hardcore driver, and it seems like Volvo, with some of their products, they've almost been pushing the driver experience, and I feel like there's been more and more overlap in that space.
I think that's on the right lines. This is a question that I pressed Engelnath on fairly hard. When the Polestar 2 was introduced, I took a picture of a slide that sort of said, "Here's what Volvo is, here's what Polestar is."
Yeah.
Volvo, both of them have versions of clean, modern Swedish design. And Polestar is not a Chinese company, as he said about 90 times. It is a Swedish and European company. Okay. That has chosen to manufacture in China, but it is rapidly diversifying its manufacturing footprint all over the world because trade tensions, obviously. But Volvo, essentially, at least in 2021, was more about the sensual feel, woods, leathers, making things
Yeah.
interesting, intuitive, and easier for its customers. Whereas Polestar was a much techier audience, if you like, a lot on sustainable materials. The comparison was made between the interior of a Polestar 2 and a really expensive running shoe. Lots and lots of sort of mesh weaves out of recycled plastics, things of this ilk. Um, not the pastels so much. Many, many, many different shades of black and gray and silver.
Right. Right.
Um, and Polestar wants to be seen as a performance brand in the traditional European vein, which is to say, you can customize suspension settings, steering settings, power
Right.
delivery settings, etc., as much as you want. Volvo, I think, is not going to let you do that. Volvo has a sense of how its cars work, how its drivers should use them, and it's all about cosseting. Whereas, if I had to put it in one word, Polestar is much more about interacting.
Interesting. Okay. And you mentioned that I know it'd been talked about, I believe, South Carolina is where Polestar's North American facilities will be. Does that mean it qualifies for the IRA or parts of it, or are the batteries still imported so it's not fully? Do you know?
The answer is we don't know yet.
Okay.
Volvo and Polestar clearly are going to be highly aware
Yeah.
of the rules around those incentives. Volvo, for a while, I think, was planning to use the get out of jail free card, which is the uh, tariff offset for exports program. But they have now essentially suspended the arrival of the EX30, the small, cheap one, which I
Right.
drove last summer, or last fall, I think, uh, until they can be built in Europe and exported to the US because they might have been able to swallow a 27% tariff or offset it. Um, Offsetting a 100% tariff is a
Right.
somewhat different kettle of fish. And so, in that sense, the US will not have a cheap Chinese EV from a European brand, the EX30, until it can be made in Europe. And the question is, will it remain as cheap?
For sure. And it's kind of been interesting to see the EX30 launch because I've heard overall positive things about it as a car, but it does seem like it's also suffered, at least talking to some people in Europe, some of the similar issues with a lot of the recent EV launches of software bugs
Yep.
and
Yep.
kind of the day to day experience of it. But I guess I'm also
Hey,
curious
before
on.
this, I had a Fisker. I was
Yeah, yeah,
I was
yeah,
driving a test Fisker when the
yeah.
company declared bankruptcy.
You know, it's funny.
That
I
has
read that
never happened
article
before.
too. Yeah, I'm kind of curious. What is there anything for those listening that you would like to share in your experience of not only just driving the Fisker Ocean, but like
Um,
literally reviewing it while that was all kind of happening in real time?
Luckily, my contact still answered my texts the day after. Um,
Or you could have had a new car.
yeah, oh, that was the question from about 80
Yeah,
people. Do you get to keep the car? No,
yeah,
they took the car back. Um, so, a couple things. It's a perfectly adequate SUV. It has some interesting features like every single window, including the third window that's fixed on every other SUV in the world, rolls down into the door. You can open the glass roof so you have, I forget what it's called, beach mode, ocean mode, something like that.
I think it's
Um,
California mode or something like that.
California
Yeah,
mode.
yeah, yeah,
Thank you.
yeah,
Yeah, I knew it was something like that.
yeah.
It's an interesting feature. I kind of chalk it up as a gimmick because how
Right.
often do you really want to put down all six windows, all seven windows, because the tailgate one drops too, in your SUV? What's the use case for this? Um, but the powertrain worked fine. My problem, and I had version 2 of the Fisker
Mm,
software. I think they didn't really give out a lot of cars till that was there. But my problem was that still it randomly flashed things are not working lights. And of course, while I was driving with my better half, who seems to be with me whenever a British car fails to proceed and an electric car melts down, I was driving with him when every single light on the dash lit up and it said basically pull over now. So I pulled over now, and having had virtually the same experience in other cars, go online on your phone, look on YouTube. How do you do
Reset it.
put it to sleep and
Yeah.
do a full cold reboot? Luckily, I found it, took less than 10 minutes, and then only one or two of the lights lit up at random for the rest of my 3 weeks, and most of them went away after a while. If you're looking, apparently used Fiskars with not a lot of miles are going in the mid-high 20s at the moment.
Which is wild. Which is, I believe, the price they were saying they were going to originally launch at, and then it kind of came up to 60s, 70s, and unfortunately,
And then they
we'll never
slashed the
know.
price. They
Right.
cut 40% out of the price. So, yeah.
There was kind of
It's
the fire sale.
it is the definition of an orphan make at this point.
Yeah. I guess speaking of just EVs again in general, we were just talking about the tax credit. What, in your experience, or what kind of are your thoughts on, is that really helping to move the needle, or is it kind of overcomplicated? Because it really does seem, I haven't been checking it too closely the last few months, but it seems like the main company that's probably getting it right now still is Tesla, due to, I think, some Mach-E's or some of the Ford products maybe are getting a little bit more. But do you think that that is a benefit, or is that really like a motivating reason to go to an EV, or is it a program that needs to be maybe rethought about?
I just look at it through the lens of price.
Yeah.
One of the concerns of late, and it's a valid concern, is that EVs are more expensive still than vehicles in their same segment with gasoline engine. True in most cases. And the whole goal of the incentive was to knock that down.
Right.
So there were changes a couple of years ago, good changes and bad changes. The best change was that instead of having to wait somewhere between, 2 and 16 months to see if you could knock it off your taxes, it is now a point of purchase rebate, which dealers will call cash on the hood. And cash on the hood is always a good thing for buying a car. The tougher part, however, is that now there are increasingly stringent requirements on where the car was built, has to be a NAFTA country, where the battery is built, and where the minerals for the cells come from. And my personal opinion is that those are necessary requirements to build a domestic industry, cell industry, mining, etc. Things we haven't really done because we were quite happy to outsource to China almost everything for 30 years. And unless we want China to control the bulk of the cars that we buy, which I think is a bad thing for America, I think these are appropriate measures. And, my friends in Washington did not call it the IRA. They called it the Mansion Bill, because he was behind a lot of those. There is, of course, the leasing loophole, which you could drive.
That's true. That is a good point.
Through. So those requirements on sourcing of minerals, assembly, and so on only apply if you're buying the car. If you are leasing the car, every single EV qualifies. So dealers are ramping up their explanations of how does a lease work for a whole bunch of people who never thought about leasing but want an EV. So I don't have data to talk about the effect. You're right that Tesla's highest volume model qualifies for that incentive. Some of its other models do not. And I've almost given up trying to track Tesla's spec changes, price changes, battery tech changes, etc. But clearly the trend is for more and more automakers to onshore production. Hyundai and Kia have their EV plant coming online later this year. Volvo did it, etc., etc., etc. And so that's one of the components, sourcing minerals elsewhere and so on. I think 3 years from now, many, many, many more vehicles will qualify for that credit on a purchase basis than do now.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. And one, I just want to say that was a very articulate and well said breakdown of its not only evolution of where it stands today. So if there is anyone listening that didn't know the details, I'm sure they know all of it now. But yeah, I know a lot of EV advocates were actually really annoyed, as you say, by the Mansion bill or kind of the additions to it. I thought that was personally a good thing. I think it kind of gave more value to give that sort of discount in addition to it being a EV. But I'm just kind of curious. Have you like reviewed any hybrids or even just combustion vehicles in the last year or two that maybe I don't know, you did the new Prius, right? Like anything that's under anyway 35,000, and I think there's something to be said that new cars have become so expensive anyways. But when you look at the delta between most new cars and EVs, especially now with like the Equinox and some others really coming on the market right now, like you look at a lot of the new prices, even with the without the tax credit, and EVs are already kind of cheaper. And so I think that's where it's been just kind of interesting to see. And I don't know if that's due to kind of the price war we're just seeing across the space in general. But I'm kind of curious on your thought as someone who reviews a lot more cars than I do around the kind of current prices of not just EVs, but also combustion vehicles.
So one of the things is that the cheapest vehicles in America, by and large, are the smallest.
Yeah.
It would have been small sedans and hatchbacks. Now it's some small sedans and some small SUVs, and they're crossovers. A lot of them, a few of them, you can't even get all-wheel drive, which for me is the defining utility benefit.
Right.
But those vehicles don't have direct straight across equivalents in the EV world yet. You're really moving up a segment to the larger compact crossovers where the Equinox comes in along with some Hyundai Kia entries. And I suppose the Mustang Mach-E sort of in there as well. But the bulk of the EVs available today are luxury or premium
Yeah.
or mid-sized or full-size. My standard lecture on this is that traditionally, new technology in automotive vehicles comes in at the top of the market in either luxury or performance because it's really expensive. And then over time, auto engineers are extremely good at making it smaller, more reliable, more compact, less expensive. And over time, it filters down. Tesla understood that. They started with the Roadster, which was six figures. Then they came in with the Model S, which was 75 grand. Now they have the Model 3 and Model Y. I continue to be disappointed that they do not appear to be pursuing the $25,000 Tesla anymore, but we'll see. And I've learned not to make too many predictions about Tesla. So I think it's a case of comparing apples to apples. You can definitely get a car for 28 grand. It may be a Toyota Corolla
That's
sedan.
fair.
There
Yeah,
is not an electric equivalent of a car in that package
for sure.
at that price.
For sure.
I forget where the Ioniq 6 starts, but that's really more of a Camry competitor
Yeah.
than a Corolla competitor.
And I like you said, it's so hard to keep track of where Tesla stuff is now. And I just know like one of their long range Model 3s now is 35 because of
Yeah.
the tax credit magic and all that stuff. So it has just been really interesting to see. And I do agree with you. Like a lot of the entry EV sedans are more like a decent entry premium because you kind of have that added benefit of it being electric. It's just quieter vehicle. It's kind of these other kind of tech features that would be traditionally reserved for a higher priced combustion vehicle. I do want to realize. I realize we're kind of coming on the end of our time, John. I don't want to be too selfish because I feel like I can always catch up with you and talk about this stuff for so long. But I really want to talk about what you're doing with the Tempting Fate tours on YouTube and some of that, and try and squeeze that in. I apologize we didn't give it more time, but I've really enjoyed the videos you're doing. And so
Well,
for
thank
anyone
you.
listening, please just kind of share a little overview, and then I would love to talk with you about it as much as we can before you have to go here.
We got about 10 minutes. So Tempting Fate Tours grew out of me and a friend in New Hampshire having really bad cabin fever after pandemic lockdown. And it was one of those late night emails with a really stupid subject line that said something about awesome Sterling trip, a Sterling being a badly built British rendition of the Acura Legend. Um, Suffice it to say, we wanted to take a Sterling from Portland to Radwood, the show in Austin, and then we doubled down and bought two of them. And we filmed the process somewhere in New Mexico. We discovered Radwood had been postponed for 4 weeks, but we ended up making it to Radwood. People seemed to like the videos. We had fun doing goofy car trips, and so it has sort of spun out from there. The latest one is clearly our most ambitious one. I found my first genuine barn find, a Morris Minor Traveler, which is a genuine woody wagon that had sat in a garage in West LA since 1968. Seriously, that was the last tag, had not moved.
That's crazy.
Tom decided to buy that one, and I have a 1949 very slow, very Art Deco Morris Minor with 27 horsepower. Condensing down a very long story that's still slowly rolling out, Tom got the Traveler running, and we are taking both of those cars overseas to a drive event in Holland, which has the great advantage that it's flat and is not very high speed, because these are two really, really slow cars. And we're in the process of rolling those videos out. There's some explanation. Surprisingly, what really seemed to take off was the one on my 49 Minor. I guess a 1949 car with 19,000 miles that has this really sort of late 30s Art Deco styling hit a nerve. But there's lots more to come in that adventure. We also ran the Lemons Rally last fall.
That was great.
In a Riley 1.5, which most people have never heard of. My friend Scott's MGB. We actually won a prize. Our evil plan worked. But you can find us at Tempting Fate Tours. That's Tempting Fate Tours on YouTube. And subscribe. We love subscribers. We love comments. We do actually answer all our comments, but check it out. This is fun because it's so unlike what I do professionally with electric vehicles. I went from driving a 1949 Morris Minor in England on the left of the road to driving a 2024 Polestar 2, and you would be hard pressed to get too much more different than those vehicles.
You're not even sure they're vehicles. Like, it's like, is this comparing it to a steam engine versus? And I have to admit, I get a sick satisfaction out of watching your videos because our daily is an electric vehicle, but then what our weekend vehicle is, and I don't know if we talked about this, but it's a 1987 Land Rover Defender 90.
Oh my! All right, you're already contaminated. Got it.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like, oh yeah, I mean, look at what John's driving right now. This thing is so unreliable compared to a Land Rover. I don't know what. And then the speeds, I'm just like, oh, he's in the double digits. This 140 horsepower we have just seems overpowering. But no,
it's always top end of a Landy of that vintage.
Well, no one's really known. It just keeps going. You just never have enough road to get to that top speed is the issue.
And slight downhills and tailwinds help.
Those help a lot. But I mean, like I always say, it'll go 40 miles an hour over anything.
Yep.
It just takes a while to get there sometimes. But and anyone listening, the links to the Tempting Fate Tours will be in the show notes today, along with John's recent articles on the Polestar 5 and more. But John, I just want to say thanks again for coming on, and need to have you on again soon.
I think we could probably do double the time, and I appreciate it. I just have another event, but
no worries at all.
Good talk,
my pleasure,
and more to come. The nice thing is I'll have more to talk about until the end of my so-called career in the EV world, and it's nice to see it playing out after 15 years where there are cars. I get a lot of questions. I stop to charge, and people ask me questions. And how long does it take to charge? Oh, I'm going to spend 15 minutes. Oh, I could never do that. It's like, okay, so you're going to go pee and you're going to go buy salty snack foods. Then you're going to play with your phone. How long did you take? And you just got to sort of connect the dots for people. So that's what I view my job as doing. You too, in your own arena. So thanks. And until next time.
Thank you, John. Talk soon.
Take care.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Grid Connections podcast. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with John Voelcker, contributing editor at Car and Driver magazine and host of the Tempting Fate Tours on YouTube channel. From latest EV sales numbers to John's thrilling experiences with GM's Ultium vehicles and his insightful trip to Polestar in England, we covered a lot of exciting ground today. But remember, if you found this episode valuable, we encourage you to share with at least one other person who would enjoy it as well. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue bringing you the latest in EV news and insights. Don't forget to also leave a positive review on our podcast page. Your feedback helps us improve and grow. Until next week, this is the Grid Connections podcast signing off.